Welcome to the SDA Housing Podcast, brought to you by NDIS Property Australia. Before starting this episode, we need to provide a general disclaimer. Information contained in this podcast is general in nature only. It does not take into account the objectives, financial situation, or needs of any particular person. You need to consider your financial situation and needs before making any decisions based on the information in this podcast. And you should consider seeking independent and professional advice for your personal circumstances. All right, let's begin.
Hello, everybody. My name is Debbie from NDIS Property Australia, and you're listening to the SDA Housing Podcast, a show that explains, highlights, guides, and brings awareness about all things SDA in this ever-changing NDIS world. Today we have a guest speaker, a new, I don't think we've ever been on one of our episodes. Dante?
I think way back at the very beginning.
Maybe you were. So Dante Sasquani, who is with SDA Options. That's right. Sorry about that. Dante is from the SDA background up here in Brisbane. He, a little while ago, left the sunny climes of Queensland, southeast Queensland, to go to Melbourne. I'm not quite sure why, but anyway. Dante is now working in the SDA scene in Melbourne, and we were having a chat recently, which is why this episode came about. You found out there's some interesting things that differentiate the SDA scene, specifically in terms of things like leases and bonds in Victoria that don't exist in other parts of the country. So I really want to find out more about this. So how are you anyway, Dante?
Yeah, I'm good. It's funny you mentioned the climate. I'm down here. I'm cold. It's windy. It's wet, but look, it's been a really good opportunity so far, and I'm enjoying it. And as you mentioned, really getting to understand a different climate down here in the SDA world, being Melbourne and Victoria. So it's been really good. A lot of learning opportunities and a lot of new opportunities as a whole in the sector, which has been really exciting.
Yeah, and look, the SDA market in Victoria is massive.
Yeah,
it's, the number of participants with SDA funding is huge and expected to grow more in Victoria than anywhere else in the country. The number of SDA construction down there is massive as well. Good and bad. We've seen a lot going on in areas that there's, significant oversupply now, and I think there's a lot more awareness of really having to do the right thing, i.e. build the right properties in the right location. But that's not really what we're talking about. I'm sure that's something else you'd love.
It could be a whole nother, yeah.
A whole nother episode. But today, we were having a conversation a week or two ago, and it was all around the lease agreements, because I was speaking with the lead who had brought this to my attention, said, well, it's a lease agreements in Victoria different to those in the other state. And I thought, well, actually, I believe that they are. I think that Victoria is the only state that has its own specific lease agreement. But I wanted to clarify. So, of course, I contacted you, Dante, because you would know, being an SDA provider now working in Victoria. And that conversation led us to a few interesting points that came up. So, yeah, firstly, let's talk about SDA leases.
Yeah, definitely. So, look, it was something that obviously in my prior role with Adapt, we weren't based in Melbourne, or we obviously didn't have any properties at that time down this way. So for me, it wasn't an area that I'd sort of delved too deeply into until making the transition down here, where I discovered that, yeah, it is slightly different in the sense that the Tenancy Legislation Act actually accommodates in its own part, specifically Specialist Disability Accommodation. So in terms of the Tenancy Act, they have got a specific SDA residency agreement, not just necessarily the general tenancy agreement that most other state and territories utilise in this sort of arrangement. So it's obviously got a few more protections in place for people with a disability, and which is obviously great. It recognises the complexities of this space and recognises the importance of those with a disability needing those level of protection when looking at the rental market, whether it be as well an SDA property or even just a general residential property on the open market that they'd be looking into.
Yeah, that was something that you brought up I thought was really interesting, that this SDA lease is used for non-SDA homes as well for anyone looking for some kind of a disability home arrangement?
Yeah, definitely. So it doesn't just cover SDA properties themselves. So it also takes into consideration it's primarily just persons with a disability, and it also encompasses those who might be supported under TAC or workplace cover. So the Traffic Accidents Commission is the TAC down here in Victoria. So they as well, if they've ended up with a permanent or significant disability, that SDA residency agreement incorporates those individuals as well. And of course, those on the NDIS being supported covers them.
So this has come out from the Consumer Affairs Department of Victoria, really protecting the rights of the tenants a lot further than the other states' lease agreements offer.
And as of 1 July, they really sort of expanded their horizon as to who that captures in terms of a market for the people with disability. As sort of mentioned, it doesn't just capture those who are on the NDIS. You know, they've sort of in a way at a state level redefined what an SDA dwelling looks like. And, you know, from a financial perspective, SDA dwellings are obviously, as we know, have to go through the rigorous process of development and also assessment. But in the eyes of the Victorian legislation and Consumer Affairs Victoria, when it comes to people with disabilities, any property in which a person with a disability is now residing in is classed as an SDA dwelling and carries those protections.
So how do they determine that a particular level of disability qualifies? When we hear about people in Australia with disabilities, the latest data just came out, and we've got 5.5 million people in Australia living with a disability, but that might be self-diagnosed. They have some form of a disability that affects some part of their life, but who monitors that? How does the Consumer Affairs know that that particular person has a disability worthy of requiring one of these leases?
Yeah, definitely. So I suppose if you look at so there's a big document that, you know, more than happy if you go to the Consumer Affairs Victoria website, it really outlines those changes in the Residential Tenancies Act. And just sort of reading a bit from it now, the way they sort of determine what these changes or who these people with a disability and who would be eligible and who would qualify for this new sort of protections is people where accommodation supports are funded by either the NDIS, Department of Families, Fairness and Housing, Transport Accident Commission, Victoria Work Cover Authority, or Commonwealth Disability Support for Older Australians program. So clients who are supported under those are those who are deemed to be, I suppose, living in that SDA dwelling. So they're the sort of the areas.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. That's clear. I guess, you know, we might come back to any other little interesting things that come under those lease agreements, which, you know, I've had a look through and they're quite comprehensive. But the other thing that I thought was really interesting is that tenants or tenants under these leases in Victoria do not pay a bond.
No. So, and I suppose before we go any further, I should stipulate that it is actually still down to the client themselves. They actually have a choice. You know, they actually don't necessarily have to enter into an SDA residency agreement. They can still opt to enter into a general tenancy agreement. They do have the choice.
Okay.
Whereas I suppose with the general tenancy agreement, bond can be taken, rent can only be increased once a year. You know, it's very similar across the board nationally in those sort of tenancy requirements and obligations. Whereas the SDA residency agreement, as you alluded to, is yes, you don't take a bond. You can't take a bond for the clients. However, you can increase rent twice a year, so every 6 months, which aligns with the disability support pension increases, which happen in March and September.
Yes.
So it does actually allow you to increase the rent twice in alignment with those. But yeah, so there's sort of the two biggest differences to note. And actually the third I should also mention is there's a bit of a controversial in a way around property damage as well. And
yeah, this is what I really wanted to talk about as well, because you mentioned, the damages are incurred by tenants in SDA homes. It is the obligation of the property owner to deal with.
yes.
So we've talked about insurances and things before, and when we've discussed this with our investors, you know, generally it comes down to what is in agreements with the SDA providers, the agreements they have with the SIL providers, that most of the time the property owner will not incur any charges to repair damages caused by tenants, but this is not the case necessarily in Victoria.
Yeah, so it can be a bit of a grey area, I suppose, at the moment where under the Victorian legislation and the Tenancies Act is if it's obviously, no different in a general residential. If it's a fair wear and tear, it can't be claimed. That's no different. However, if it's due to their disability or due to a piece of equipment that relates to their disability, this is where it becomes a bit contentious in this fact that the legislation does put it back on the property owner to be liable and responsible to repair those damages within a timely manner. It's obviously not deemed as an urgent repair necessarily. It does come down to what it may be, but it is the obligation and the mercy of the owner, once reported, to make good those damages. If, like I said, if it's due to the disability of the client and or due to a piece of equipment, i.e. a wheelchair, scrapes along the wall. So it really opens up the conversation when it looks at the designs of these SDA properties around what can be done as a preventative maintenance sort of element or what can be done to sort of
preventative design
as well, whether it might be clear perspex, 1200 high, or even, I know VJ being MDF is a bit stronger. And it's a lot easier just to throw a lick of paint rather than just your plasterboards on those walls, either just be 1200 high. So there are obviously preventative approaches, but again, it's ones that is sort of not many are aware of when it comes to Victorian legislation and the actual requirements around the repair costs.
Yeah. So is there any differentiation between where the damage is caused accidentally or deliberately?
It's really hard. It comes down to that incident reports as provided by the provider, and there is a lot of onus put onto the service provider that's operating out of the property, and it's really important between an SDA provider and a care provider, a support provider, to have that property collaboration agreement in place, which really outlines those roles, rules and responsibilities. They're the eyes and ears from a day-to-day perspective of the care provider. As an SDA provider, you're always on the outside looking in, doing your routine inspections, but from a day-to-day perspective, there is a lot of reliance and trust put into the support provider that it's being reported and it's being noted correctly, particularly if there's any property damage or maintenance that needs to be actioned.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, it's always got to be down to the SILs. I mean, it is their workplace and they are in there 24/7 in most cases.
Yeah, correct. And, for example, that the office space in the OOA, if there's any damage in there, well, it's unlikely that the expectation would be that the owner would be paying for those repairs because, well, it's the office space. It really puts the question out as to, well, how was the damage caused? What happened? Was there a neglect in your duty of care potentially in somewhere for this client that led to this property damage that could have occurred there? But, so there's still a lot of investigation that does get done before the owner may necessarily have to fork out to repair, but it is certainly good to just be aware of and mindful that, you can't just turn it back and say the client must pay because, again, from an income perspective, many of these clients don't have significant funds, and under state trustee, it's always can be quite limited as to how much money they may have to repair these damages. But of course, if it's malicious, circling back, if it is malicious damage that isn't warranted, then it's certainly payable by the tenant.
Right. Oh, that's good to know.
Yeah.
I did actually reach out to Jeremy Thornton, who our listeners will know because we've done a couple of episodes with him on the insurance aspects in SDA as a property owner. And I just want to read out his response. And it was that state-based legislation can be murky, so it can catch us off guard. I would argue that the fact that the property owners are liable for damages defeats the purpose of NDIS funds for maintenance that are available. Either way, it would still come down to a responsibility on the side of the provider, either SIL or SDA. If it's written into the contracts or agreements that minor damage, regardless of intent, is to be deemed maintenance and repairable by the provider, then this would override the condition. He's mentioned a few things. But yeah, look, that's just stating, it sounds scary, but I think at the end of the day, it still comes down to common sense on who really is liable and who's going to have to pay the charges.
Correct. And obviously we want to make sure that this doesn't deter quality SDAs being brought forth into the market. It'd be disappointing that listeners or property investors or developers, when they catch wind that this is in fact the case, that this deters them, because in no means is this the case or is this the purpose by the Victorian government introducing this. It's nothing new. It's always been in the legislation. So particularly if you're already an investor or a developer in the SDA space in Victoria, it wouldn't be news to you. And
It's always been there.
Yeah, and most of the time, providers, as you touched on, providers will manage it and deal with it on the spot and may not necessarily deem it as being appropriate or necessary to get the owner or the SDA provider too heavily involved when it comes to cost repairing.
Good to know, because obviously there is a lot of people investing in property, estate property in Victoria at the moment. And of course, this is just overall properties, whether it's a house, whether it's an apartment, it's all the same.
Yeah, exactly. And it always comes down, it's a big responsibility on that SDA provider and the still provider to be still in some way vetting the clients in which are sort of being presented to go into these properties. It's really ensuring that a robust funded client who may have evidence of property damage prior is not being put forth for a high physical support or a fully accessible or even improved mobility for that matter property. So there is still making sure that the right client is being put into the right property for their needs.
Sure. And I guess that's where it also comes down to, bespoke design of properties too. If there is a chance that you think you might have participants that could be, especially if you are building robust, the minimum SDA specifications we know are nowhere near good enough.
No.
So you need to be speaking with the right people when you're designing these houses and making sure they are built to be far more, damage proof, whether it is a robust or whether it is a HPS, making sure, as you said, that, accidental wheelchair damage isn't going to happen because the design of the property, the materials that are being used are adequate, and it's going to reduce those incidences of accidental damage by equipment or whatever.
Yeah, certainly. And, it's the whole sort of double-edged sword where, yes, it might cost you more money up front to put in that little bit extra material or a bit higher quality material. But in the long run, is it going to save you in cost in terms of upkeep and maintenance? So it's, you can look at it from two different angles. I know our robust properties that we've currently got down in Victoria at the moment, the walls are it's basically solid brickwork. So in terms of we don't use just your higher impact sheeting for your plasterboard. We actually just use solid block work because end of the day, it needs to be and exceed those minimum standards because unfortunately the minimum standards at this point in time don't actually quite meet the clients needing this sort of accommodation, unfortunately.
No, absolutely. So yeah, it all comes down to future proofing as we're always talking about, going above and beyond and I guess putting in that extra expense that as an investor you feel is warranted to, cut down on future costs of vacancies, of maintenance and repairs. So it all comes down into it. It's just another aspect we probably haven't really considered when we're talking about future proofing, but I think it's very valid.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And occupational therapists and the likes of other allied health professionals who tend to do a report or an assessment prior to those tenants moving in, they do see it and they do obviously commend those future proofing and those going above and beyond for those properties. It's certainly a lot more appealing out in the industry and is well respected and appreciated when that's done because it just helps the clients in the long run and really solidifies that likelihood of a long-term tenancy, knowing that this is a suitable property for them.
For sure. And that's going off a topic a little bit. That you mentioned that the support coordinators and other occupational therapists, and allied health professionals. I don't know that a lot of investors really are aware of the process that a participant will go through before they end up moving into a property. So they might find the property or their OT or support coordinator may, find a number of properties that could be suitable. But at the end of the day, it's not just the participant, but their family, their OT, their allied health workers who need to ensure that property meets their needs. And so when we're talking about future-proofing, it's not necessarily, yes, it's absolutely to make sure that you're creating a property that is going to be as desirable as possible for the participant, but it's also got to be desirable for all those other decision makers. Yeah,
correct. So at the end of the day, obviously the client is the one who's going to be residing there, but there are a lot of stakeholders involved in that decision-making process, as touched on, whether it be allied health, whether it be behaviour support practitioners or psychologists or whoever it may be. There's a lot of stakeholders who are involved in the decision-making process. And, it's also proximity to those those services. It may be a property is identified that's liked and is suitable on, southeast of Melbourne, but all of their supports are in West Melbourne. So they're still all taken into consideration as to where they may end up in terms of their property. So it's, it's quite a large and complex space, and the number of people involved when it comes to the decision. It's not just you like the property and you go.
Absolutely not. And investors, and quite rightly so, if they haven't been in, the learning phase of SDA and how it all works for long. They just think, there's all these participants out there with this funding, it'd be easy to find tenants.
Yeah, no, unfortunately, if only.
If only, exactly.
Yeah, so there's a lot involved, and there's quite a complex space, and everyone's unique. Everyone's story is different and everyone's needs are different. So we, sometimes can get wrapped up thinking, if we build it, they will come. But we've really got to take a step back and, be considerate of how unique everyone's situation may be, and really, understand the space that we're delivering these properties.
Yeah,
clientele
totally. So that was a little bit off topic, but yeah.
That's back
to that. No, we always do that. Back to the whole surrounding the tenants' rights that Consumer Affairs Victoria have brought in with these specifics that are not requirements in other states. Obviously, they are good for the tenant. It's been a learning curve for yourself. Are there any other little quirks in the Victorian market that you've come across of late?
I suppose, and this probably falls more so on an SDA provider rather than an owner, but it's still good to be sort of mindful of, is what we call a notice of temporary relocation. So similar to, I suppose, a breach notice that can be issued in a standard tenancy arrangement. A notice of temporary relocation, I suppose the best way to look at it is like a reset for that client in the property. So, for example, say you've given them warnings and they're not allowed to continue smoking in the house, but they continue to do so. You can issue what we call a notice of temporary relocation for a maximum of 90 days. So it means that there could be an alternate property that client could be relocated to as a bit of a reset prior to coming back to that property. And generally speaking, if you're issuing a notice of relocation, you may also be issuing a notice to vacate, but these all carry significant timelines of about 90 days that are required to be issued. So that's sort of another little quirk, you could call it, with the legislation and the Act, where that notice of temporary relocation has to be provided before you can give a notice to vacate by the provider. And like I said, it's just an opportunity or a chance for that client to potentially have a bit of a reset away. That might be at an STA property. It could be a motel. It's not really, doesn't really matter too much as to what it may look like. It's just an opportunity that has to be presented to that client. So the eviction process, if that was ever to be explored down here in Victoria, is a little bit more complex. That needs to be taken into consideration if there were to be any complications with the clients in the SDA dwelling.
Have you ever had any instances personally yourself working with either ADAPT or SDA Options that you know of that you've had to evict participants?
Yes, had a couple across both Queensland and Victoria. Victoria certainly is much more complex than Queensland when it comes to the eviction process, and it comes down to the protection of people with a disability down here. It's having that legislation is, whilst it's great, it's in writing, there is still some level of grey. As you mentioned, a bit murky, Victoria or state legislation. However, yes, it's something that I've done and been down through the process. But again, it's certainly not a short exercise or a quick exercise by any means.
Nor a common situation.
No, certainly not common either. It's very, very rare that it'll get to that point. Most, through some level of mediation, can come to a resolution.
Yeah, I would imagine that's always going to be the first option, to do that to the absolute utmost of both parties' abilities to avoid that situation.
Correct. But, it's still important that, it's all about obviously integration back in the community. These clients, whether it be with SDA or just a person with a disability, there should be no reason that we should necessarily be treating them any different to anyone else who has tenancy rights across the country. So that's one of the really, really big things, is we don't want to see any level of discrimination. We want to ensure that tenancy rights and any rights for that matter are no different, be it with a disability or not.
Mm. So now, with your experience working in both Queensland and Victoria and seeing these additional rights that the tenants in Victoria have, do you think it should be extended throughout the country? All the other states should bring in something similar?
Yeah, definitely. I do think I really like, I suppose, there's always going to be some rooms for improvement no matter where, but I really like what they've introduced as of the 1st July, where not so much they could have chosen a different definition and a different name rather than an SDA dwelling and an SDA resident. However, the concept of broadening the scope of those who are covered under that disability rights, I think, is certainly something that should be well adopted across the board, because, you know, you obviously hear stories of people with disability who are out there trying to find a rental property like everyone else, but unfortunately they're put to the bottom of the pile. You know, whilst it's never commonly come out and said that that's what happens, unfortunately it's the case where they're never necessarily equally given consideration as per anyone else. So this sort of helps mitigate that or reduce that happening with this extension and scope of disability act that the Victorian government have introduced or expanded upon as of the 1st of July, which is, certainly something I think that should be adopted across the country. You know, as mentioned, there's still some room for improvement and certainly a few things that could be amended slightly just to create a bit more of an equal playing field, so to speak, for all parties involved. But yeah, it's certainly something that I think Victoria is ahead of the game when it comes to rights for people with disability.
Yeah, cool. And I guess that, you know, we obviously see there are some minor differences in how SDA providers operate in Victoria. And the fact that, you know, it did seem strange when we first came across this, that whilst an SDA provider is essentially the property manager, and whilst some SDA providers do the property management side, they do farm that out to real estate agents. Some, others keep it in-house, and yet they do that without having a real estate license, which is, you know, if we're coming from a real estate background, you're like, what? How can they be a property manager and not be a licensed real estate agent? And yes, they're a registered NDIS provider, so there is still a level of registration required. But, you know, I don't know if there's any moves in Victoria to try and make that a little bit more coherent between the two real estate license and the SDA provider registration, and whether that is something that eventually might become more standardised across the country as well.
Yeah, and that's where I suppose it becomes quite complex around, you know, this SDA residency agreement. You know, the conversation, as you read throughout the agreement, it's very much relating to the SDA provider. You know, it's mentioning the SDA provider. That's the terminology that's used. And as I sort of alluded to, the definition of an SDA provider has expanded with this recent change. You know, it doesn't just now include an actual SDA provider like SDA Options or Adapt Housing or Everhomes. You know, an SDA provider in Victoria's state legislation under the Tenancy Act could be a private landlord, is now an SDA provider, because you're delivering or you're offering an SDA dwelling, which isn't an SDA dwelling. So that's where
it's a disability dwelling to someone who falls into one of those categories that.
Yeah. So this is where it gets, as we talked about, a bit murky around the confusion of people potentially misunderstanding when they say I'm an SDA provider or I have an SDA dwelling, because, well, you don't, I suppose. By definition at a state level you may, but obviously as a federally recognised definition of under the NDIA and NDIS, what is an SDA dwelling and who is an SDA provider is a completely different scene.
Yeah. Oh, it just adds to the confusion of it all.
It does. It's and like we always say, it's always changing, and it's something we've always got to try and keep on top of. Like I said, it's certainly the right steps forward for a person with a disability down here in Victoria and giving them a more equal playing field when it comes to finding suitable accommodation. But it's obviously just making sure everyone else involved is able to get their heads wrapped around it all.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I have no more questions. Was there anything else that we didn't cover that you wanted to add at all, Dante?
No, not at all. Obviously, if you're anything like myself, there's always going to be further questions you may have hearing it for the first time. So always happy to sort of answer or clarify moving forward. And obviously, if you wanted to reach out directly to Debbie, I'm more than happy if she wants to share my contact details and we can discuss further.
Fabulous.
Because, always here to help. And, you know, it's all about education in the space and making sure that we're all of the same understanding. So more than happy to provide that knowledge.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you so much. And on that note, Dante, we will leave it and look forward to having you back on another episode in the future sometime.
Yeah, no, thank you, Debbie. I appreciate it.
Fabulous. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please make sure you are subscribed and following us so you can keep in the loop with all of our upcoming episodes. We would really appreciate it if you could leave us a 5-star rating, a written review, and to share this podcast with those that could benefit. Until next time, catch you on the next episode.